You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. On this edition, we'll dig into the city's budget for homelessness, how $1 billion will be allocated, and why.
It's also important to remember when thinking about our budget that of that $1 billion, 60% is going towards housing, going towards permanent solutions, and this is not for those 8,000 people. These are for the people who are formerly homeless and who we've been able to successfully move out of homelessness with supportive housing or with rental assistance. So our program, our budget, it's not exclusively designed for those 8,000 people experiencing homelessness on a single night.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic. San Francisco's Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing is a relatively new department, but it and its budget have been growing rapidly. For a variety of reasons, including that revenue from a 2018 ballot measure that was tied up in court for a long time is now available, the department's budget is now more than $1.1 billion over 2 years. The money will be spent on a variety of programs. Those include placing people in housing, finding ways to keep people who are in precarious housing situations in place, opening parking sites for people living in their vehicles, family shelters, temporary shelters, and supportive services. Emily Cohen, Interim Director for Strategy and External Affairs at the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, explained how this budget was developed and where these investments are being focused. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about the budget.
Thanks for having me.
So that budget, in total, it's about $1 billion over the next 2 years, and that encompasses federal, state, and local resources. $1 billion is a big number, but the city also has a big budget, and this is a big problem. And the department's website outlines a few things that this budget enables, but I want to have you just talk about some of those different approaches that this money goes to, because it's not just emergency shelter, it's not just getting people into housing, it's not just prevention, it's a little bit of all those things, right? What is this really about, this budget?
Yes, thank you. That's a great place to start. The mayor recently signed the new budget, which has, as you mentioned, leverages over $1 billion in local, state, and federal resources to address the homelessness crisis in our community. And this reflects about a 62% growth since fiscal year 1920 and includes really historic investments across our system of care. These investments go into everything from homelessness prevention, emergency shelter, as well as permanent solutions to homelessness, long-term housing for people to exit homelessness and leave homelessness ultimately behind. And this budget, which is a reflection of our values and our commitment to addressing the crisis of homelessness, is heavily invested in evidence-based solutions to the crisis, such as permanent supportive housing, rental subsidies, and rapid rehousing or a medium-term rental assistance. We know that these programs are effective in not just moving people off the street, but in ending their homelessness. And one of the things I'm most excited about this budget is its significant commitment to these types of solutions.
So one of the critiques or concerns that I hear and see most frequently from people who don't necessarily work in the field of homelessness service or prevention is to just break down the budget of this office by the number of homeless people. You hear the number 8,000 a lot because that's roughly the number of people that's counted in this biennial count of people visible on the street. And I think there are a number of problems with this framing, one of which is that the number of homeless people is actually pretty hard to nail down because, people might receive services from the city or nonprofits that are keeping them from becoming homeless, or it might be keeping them from returning to the streets. But just generally, can we peel that apart a little bit? I'd like to let you respond to that way of looking at it, just like this budget per number of homeless people flat out, and then I have some more specific questions.
Absolutely. So it's important to keep in mind that 8,000 person estimate is on a single night. That's based on our point in time count. So that is one night in January when we do a census of everyone experiencing homelessness in our community. That said, if you are homeless on Tuesday night, you may not be homeless on Wednesday night, and you might not have been homeless on Monday, right? This is one night. And so over the course of the year, we estimate that nearly 3 times that many people will come through an experience of homelessness. And so when we talk about our budget, we are not talking about 8,000 static individual experiences of homelessness, but we're talking about when we're talking about our budget, we're talking about the number of people who will touch our system of care through the course of the year. And for people who were able to prevent from becoming homeless, they certainly will never get counted in that 8,000 because we were able to assist them before they became homeless. Additionally, that 8,000 does not count the over 25,000 people who've been exited out of homelessness by the city over the last several years. And so
25,000?
That is a number since, I think it's like since 2005.
Wow.
That have moved through the system of care and have ended homelessness in our community. And so really, when we talk about 8,000, right, we're talking about a single night in our community in 2019. That does not reflect the number of people who will experience homelessness over the course of the year. It's also important to remember when thinking about our budget, or important to know, that of that $1 billion, 60% of that investment is going towards housing, going towards permanent solutions. And this is not for those 8,000 people. These are for the people who are formerly homeless and who we've been able to successfully move out of homelessness with supportive housing or with rental assistance. So our program, or our budget, it's not exclusively designed for those 8,000 people experiencing homelessness on a single night. We shelter and house 14,000 people every night.
When I hear you talk about this, it makes me doubt that the city allocates money in the way that people are framing it. Like, we need X amount of money to provide services for each homeless person, because there are different kinds of services also. So how do you determine which of those services to prioritize and invest in? You just mentioned housing and exit from homelessness. Does the number of people who need that particular kind of service kind of determine this is how much is allocated, or is it allocated in a different way than that?
We have a spectrum of services designed to address the homelessness crisis: prevention, temporary shelter, outreach, and housing. And the housing can take form of permanent supportive housing, a rental voucher, or short and medium term rental assistance, right? So we have a wide portfolio, and we really try to target those interventions towards people based on their needs. But we utilize our data to help us determine where the gaps in our system are and to where to drive new investments. And so we certainly know that we have people every day who we cannot house. We have people every day who we cannot shelter because of capacity limits. So looking at the demand for the services relative to what exists helps us drive our investments. And that's why you'll see such a significant growth of investment in housing as a permanent solution to homelessness. Additionally, we're investing significantly in temporary shelter, so new options to help relieve the crisis experience of unsheltered homelessness, both for the person living that experience as well as for the community as a whole. We know that everybody is healthier and safer when people have a place to be inside, even if it's temporary. And so investments into shelter are incredibly important. And this year, we saw an unprecedented investment in homelessness prevention, and we're really excited about this. We are aware that given the economic impacts of COVID-19, the lifting of eviction moratoriums in the near future, we are going to have a crisis on our hands in terms of the number of people who may be newly homeless or homeless for the first time because of the economic crisis. And having homelessness prevention services in place is going to be essential to helping those folks avoid sort of an ultimate crisis of homelessness.
Yes, and that sounds like a particularly thorny thing to figure out how to deal with because, on one hand, this isn't imminent yet. The eviction moratorium is not yet expired. And so you're kind of trying to predict how something is going to shake out. And then the other factor there is, there are other departments and programs at various different levels of government that are trying to keep people housed by helping them with, paying their back rent and things like that. And so it sounds like you just have to coordinate across so many different organizations and agencies and departments and things like that while also trying to predict how something that hasn't happened yet is going to affect people.
Absolutely. Prevention it sounds like an easy thing to do. Homelessness prevention's
just give people money to pay their rent. Easy.
It's incredibly complicated. We are really focused. And, I think there's a lot of discussion in the community about eviction prevention, which is incredibly important. But we're specifically talking about homelessness prevention, which is a slightly different thing. because not everyone who experiences homelessness has an original tendency to preserve, right? People might be living in stable but informal housing situations prior to an experience of homelessness. So just focusing on preserving a tenancy will not adequately prevent homelessness. We need to be essentially at the shelter front door. When people come for immediate assistance, come because they're in a place of crisis, we need to be there to help them identify alternative places and help them stabilize in the housing that they can still access, whether that be with a formal lease or not. And so I think that that's a really important distinction between eviction prevention and homelessness prevention. And we are responsible for homelessness prevention, but we do it in deep coordination with our partners who do larger community stabilization and eviction prevention work, because these are all fine lines for people who are maybe experiencing that crisis.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at the categories of what's in this budget more specifically. The approved 2020-2021 budget is broken down into street outreach, prevention and problem solving, coordinated entry, temporary shelter, and then housing. And housing is by far the biggest portion of that funding. It's like 54% of that budget in the breakdown. So let's start there. What all does that housing category include?
So this housing category is incredibly exciting. As I was saying before, housing is the solution to homelessness, or the most, effective solution to homelessness. And it doesn't necessarily need to be permanent supportive housing, but we are really looking at expanded investments here. We have resources, about $400 million in this budget, to acquire new permanent supportive housing buildings. So this is long-term.
Just briefly, can you say what permanent supportive housing means?
Permanent supportive housing means long-term housing for people exiting homelessness that has on-site social services to help them stabilize. So just like you or I might have in our apartment, we have a lease, and that lease does not have a termination, right? This is not shelter. People don't have to leave after 6 months or a year. This is their home. And we know that for folks who might have multiple disabilities or multiple challenges to housing stability, they're going to need a little extra support. Some folks might need a lot of extra support to stay stably housed. And so permanent supportive housing merges that long-term affordability, it is subsidized housing, with those supportive services. And so we have resources in this budget to acquire and operate 800 to 1,000 new units of permanent supportive housing. We also have in the housing section of this budget approximately 1,500 units of what we call a flexible housing subsidy pool. This is a terrible government name for a really great program. This is essentially a mobile rental voucher that people experiencing homelessness can use to rent housing in the private market. And this is locally funded.
So kind of like Section 8, but at a local level.
Locally funded, exactly. And this also includes a level of supportive services needed to stabilize people. It also includes housing search assistance, helping you get into the housing, kind of get you set up. And then we also have medium-term subsidies. So in other communities, this might be called rapid rehousing. The terms are sort of interchangeable, but is essentially up to 2 years of rental assistance. And this program works very, very well for people who have economic barriers to housing stability, who need some time to get stabilized, potentially get back into the workforce or stabilize their income in some way, and that they will then transition in place over time. And so these medium-term subsidies are incredibly effective, while not in the budget specifically, but also an incredibly exciting development is the allocation of over 900 new emergency housing choice vouchers from the federal government that will be coming to San Francisco. And these are similar in terms that they are tenant-based subsidies that can be used in the community to rent housing at an affordable rate for people at risk of or experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, tenant-based, meaning they go with the tenant rather than project-based, which means they're for a specific building or like community,
Absolutely.
Right? I'm speaking with Emily Cohen, Interim Director for Strategy and External Affairs at the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing. So the categories that I named earlier, those are just for services. There's other significant portions of this budget, which include COVID response at 19.5% of the budget and HSH staffing and operations at just 3.1% of the budget. I do want to get to staffing in a bit, but looking at the biggest portion there, which is COVID response, this was further broken down into shelter-in-place hotels at 72%, so by far the biggest portion, and then also congregate shelters at 23% of the budget, supportive housing, and administration. Administration is 2%. Let's look at shelter-in-place hotels. How does the funding for this work, and how does it factor into the budget? Because I understand that FEMA is providing quite a bit of reimbursement for this.
Yeah, so FEMA is currently reimbursing for non-congregate shelters, which we have locally called shelter-in-place hotels. And these are exactly what it sounds like. These are hotels that we have master leased for the COVID pandemic to provide non-congregate shelter options to people who experiencing homelessness, but particularly for people who have a higher likelihood of a severe COVID impact. So people who are COVID vulnerable. And the idea is to ensure that those folks are not in congregate shelter, but that they have an opportunity to continue to be sheltered in a safer way. So we leased, over the course of the pandemic, have leased 25 shelter-in-place hotels. FEMA reimbursement is set to expire at the end of September. So the resources to fund this program are coming to an end. And however, we know that it was going to take us through the next fiscal year to wind this program down in a supportive and ethical way, meaning the time it takes to partner with people staying at the hotels to move them into stable places to go afterwards. The majority of folks, really, that is a focus on getting them into permanent housing. And that is going to take us time. And so the city is prepared to assume the cost of the shelter-in-place hotels throughout the duration of the wind down. And that's what's in that budget.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So is there any federal funding that's reflected in there that's counted into that number?
I believe what is in there is the $110 million to maintain the SIP hotel program from now until May 2022, and that is through a local funding.
Okay, great. You've said before, and you were just mentioning here, that the goal here is to avoid sending people back out onto the street when their stay in the shelter-in-place hotel ends, which makes a lot of sense. Obviously, you don't want to take people in off the street and then send them back out to the street. Can you talk about how the department's going to be doing that and how it has been so far?
Absolutely. So we have already started our rehousing process. So we have met with and assessed, about 93% of the people staying in our shelter-in-place hotels to understand their need, both vulnerability to COVID as well as other barriers to strengths and other barriers to permanent housing. And for folks who entered the program prior to November, which is when we originally thought we were going to begin winding down the shelter-in-place hotels, we made a commitment to them that we would offer them housing as their exit strategy. And we are continuing to live up to that commitment. And so for those folks, we either can offer them permanent supportive housing, we can offer them that flexible housing subsidy pool that I talked about previously, that mobile tenant-based voucher. We can offer them short-term rental assistance for up to a year, or medium-term rental assistance, which is that slightly longer duration. So for the folks who entered the program sort of prior to November, we've made a commitment to offering them housing as their primary exit. For people who've entered since then, we're doing assessments to find out their vulnerability and their needs. And for some folks who are more vulnerable, we will be prioritizing them for housing as well. And then for those who are less vulnerable, we'll be working to identify solutions and safe places for them to go that may be housing that is not necessarily city funded, or it could be shelter as a last resort. But the idea is for everyone to have an offer of somewhere stable to go when their hotel closes so that nobody is forced to return to the street.
Mm-hmm. You had talked earlier about how this budget also reflects investment to some degree in temporary shelter. We've just talked about why people were going into non-congregate shelters. I mean, this is a pandemic issue. Is there a concern about, the return of congregate shelters, or is that temporary shelter that's being invested in, is that non-congregate?
A little bit of both. So Reopening our congregate shelters is going to be essential to meeting the pure bed capacity needs that we have in our community. We have more people sleeping outside than we have beds. And we know that there are people asking every day to get into shelter. So
Yeah, I think that wait list is perpetually like 1,000 people long or something, right?
Well, correct. And we've actually closed the wait list during COVID because we were not entering new people into the congregate shelter system and through the same process. So the congregate shelter system is currently operating and has been operating throughout COVID, but at a much lower capacity. So in alignment with health guidance, we will gradually increase beds within the congregate shelter system. And we have lots of protocols in place for addressing COVID, for ensuring safety within those, ensuring safety as best possible within the shelters. So that is one component of the work, but then also looking at different options for shelter. So we received funding in this year's budget for 2 safe parking programs. So these are particularly designed for people who are homeless and residing in either an RV or a vehicle or passenger vehicle, to offer them a safe place to bring themselves and their vehicles and to connect with a program. So it'll operate like a shelter, but people would have the option to continue to stay in their vehicle. So really excited about that. We piloted this last year in the Upper Yards lot near Balboa Bart, and it was incredibly successful. So really excited to have the resources to expand this. Additionally, we are continuing a trailer program that we opened as part of the COVID response. This is 120 trailers that the city either acquired or received from the state to provide essentially individual shelter units for people experiencing homelessness. We are also continuing the Safe Sleep program that was launched under the COVID response. And this includes space for approximately 160 tents for people who either, if we don't have room in shelter, or who would prefer the privacy of a tent and interested in staying outdoors, we are offering them a place off of the sidewalk where they can connect with services, connect with healthcare, connect with meals, and be safely off the street. We also have resources in here for a new family shelter, non-congregate family shelter, which is very exciting, as well as resources for new hotel voucher programs for particularly vulnerable populations. So a lot in there.
There's so many. There is a lot in there, and there's so many things that I want to ask about. But one thing that you brought up is being excited to have the resources for certain things. I mean, on one hand, one thing that stands out about looking at this budget as an outsider is, oh my God, it is pretty significant. And also this department's budget has been growing, rapidly and significantly in a short period of time. But on the other hand, it sounds like there just is always much more demand for these various programs than the city can actually supply. Like you mentioned, there's more people on the streets than there are beds in the shelters. There's, a successful safe parking program, but more vehicles out on the street than can fit into these lots, right?
Absolutely. And that's why we can't do this alone. Not San Francisco or any other city. We have to work regionally. We have to work in partnership with the state and federal government, because the needs are significant, but the needs aren't San Francisco only. And so the better our neighbors do in addressing their homeless crises, the better we will do as well. And so really looking to the state, and really excited about the state budget that also just came out, and many of the resources included there, because it will take all levels of government working together to address the needs of our communities. I think it's also really important that we have diversity within our homeless response system. No two homeless people are exactly the same, and we want to make sure that their unique needs are being met by having a diverse array of programs to offer.
There's so many things that we could talk about, but there's only a limited amount of time. So I do want to go in the direction of staffing, which is something I said I would get into, because it seems like actually only a really tiny portion of the budget is going to administration and staff. But in an interview with KQED, the department's director, Shireen McSpadden, she was emphasizing that the department is doing a lot of hiring. And this was late June. And at the time, she said the department had like 130 staff members and around 80 open positions. So that's a lot of people. You mentioned at the time that the department's budget is, growing significantly. I think at the time it was like 62%. Can you talk about what kinds of hires this increased budget will enable you to make and what kind of staff the department needs?
Absolutely. So the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing is relatively young. We were formed in 2016, and
yeah,
we have struggled to have the staffing capacity needed to really execute on all of these new investments. And I think this is something that we've struggled with over time, and really excited to see the investments in the personnel that it will take to achieve success across our system of care that is in this budget. I know that it's always a trade-off when making investments in a scarce resource environment. Do you invest in personnel and staff, or do you invest in programs and dollars to get right out on the street? And what's so great about this budget is that it does both. That we have the opportunity to invest in our personnel infrastructure, right? The human capital needed to do this work, while simultaneously investing in the beds, the housing units, the care and services that people experiencing homelessness in our community need. These new positions, which we're rapidly filling, are really across our entire department, including program managers for our housing and housing subsidy programs. These are the folks who help execute our contracts and help manage the agreements with the nonprofit partners and help really implement the programs, get them out on the street. For housing, we have positions like that. Similarly, for prevention in our budget, for safe sleep. Safe sleep is a new intervention that didn't have any dedicated staff working on it outside of the COVID command center. So really building up that capacity. Data and performance is essential. We have to be tracking these investments. It's incredibly important that the community understand what they're getting for these investments. And it's incredibly important that we can tell the story of the success and use our data to improve performance and outcomes. And so investing in their data systems as well as our data and performance staff is going to be critical. Additionally, we're very excited around centering equity, racial equity in all of the work that we do. We have 2 positions dedicated, a chief equity officer position, and as well as an equity trainer that are going to be embedded in our department to help us achieve the goals that we've outlined in our racial equity plan. Unit. It's a small unit, but it's really exciting to be able to utilize that data to think about how to drive and invest in future programs and do that type of planning, as well as contracts, fiscal, and HR positions. So it's growth across the department. If folks listening are interested in coming to work for an incredibly dynamic and exciting department, please visit our website and check out the career positions that are available, because we are always looking for hardworking, dedicated, brilliant people to join our team.
And this is across areas of expertise.
Absolutely.
So this is like people who are working on the ground as well as people who are working more in admin and in analysis?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is there any update? I know this is not necessarily part of the budget, but is there any update on those 80 open positions, how far along you are in filling those?
We are bringing on new people every day. Prior to the passage of the budget, we actually reduced our staff vacancy down to 9%, which is the lowest it has been. And then we received all this new funding, which is a great problem to have. So we are definitely improving our vacancy rate, and we just received funding for a bunch of new positions. So it's a work in progress, but really excited to be able to bring in the expertise and the staff that we need to get this done on behalf of our community.
Mm-hmm. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about where a lot of this funding has come from. A big chunk of the allocation to this department, as I understand it, comes from money that was basically drawn from something called Our City, Our Home, which is an initiative better known as Prop C, a 2018 ballot measure. And that money has an oversight committee, which made recommendations for how that money should be spent. This is advisory only, as far as I know. But in the remarks about the mayor's budget on the department website, it notes that this budget reflected 95% alignment with the recommendations of that oversight committee. I'm curious, what are those 5% that are different?
Well, and that was our proposed budget. I think by the time the
Right.
budget got passed, we were probably closer to 99% alignment.
Okay.
It's incredibly close. There were a few areas where we differentiated in terms of amount of investment for different projects, and there were a couple very, very population-specific recommendations from the Our City, Our Home committee that the department didn't end up being in the overall city budget because we pulled back and focused on a broader constituency with the similar program investment. So we might not have drilled down to a very granular level in our budget allocations, although we did align on priority populations to serve. So very little daylight between the final budget and the recommendations from Our City, Our Home.
Could you drill down a little bit more specifically about like what populations where you pulled back from and looked more generally, and where the amounts were different?
For example, the committee recommended some very specific funding for justice-involved families and justice-involved women. And we are very much interested in serving families and women who have been involved in the justice system, but we want to fund programs a little bit more broadly, so that they're not quite so narrow, so that we have the flexibility to move funding around as needed and not necessarily tie into a very, very small subset of the population. It's more a difference of approach in how to budget than really a difference in desire for program.
Yeah. So I think one thing that this pandemic has made clear, and we've already talked about this to a degree, is that homelessness is a public health issue. And we saw COVID outbreaks in shelters. We saw the conversation around the shelter-in-place hotels. We can see how much poverty and information access is an issue when it comes to vaccine access. All of that, relates to public health and just the health of the city overall. The pandemic isn't over. So with that said, what aspects of homelessness and of this public health problem do you feel are really prioritized in this budget, and that the department really wants to focus on moving forward?
I think the general public is catching up with those of us who have been working in homelessness for a long time in understanding that housing truly is healthcare. We cannot shelter in place without a place to shelter in place. We cannot get well. We cannot do the healing that we need to do, whether that's economic healing, family healing, or physical healthcare, mental healthcare healing, without stability. And home is essential to that. And so these investments in permanent housing, to me, are investments in our public health. This is what is going to keep incredibly vulnerable people the safest that we can keep them, is by having them in homes rather than in congregate settings, encampments on the street, outdoor environments. These investments really are aligned with our health, the health focus of the city. On a very granular level, investing in, we have all sorts of shelter options that we're investing in that are non-congregate, that are COVID informed. But the primary way that we can protect people experiencing homelessness from the worst impacts of COVID-19 is to get them into homes.
Well, that's hard to argue with. Emily, is there anything else that you want to talk about that I didn't specifically ask you about?
There is one thing I would like to say. I think the public, myself included, we are eager to see these dollars on the street. We are eager to see $1 billion in action. And I do want to let folks know that this is going to take time. Homelessness was not created overnight. It will not be solved overnight. But these resources will not be deployed overnight. This is going to take some time to ensure that we have the program design, the partnerships with nonprofits, the oversight all set up so that we can be incredibly successful. So I am eager to see the impact of $1 billion on our streets and sidewalks and in the lives of people experiencing homelessness. But I do want to caution that this will take time. And so I ask for everyone's partnership and patience as we roll out this huge investment.
Emily, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That was Emily Cohen, Interim Director for Strategy and External Affairs at the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing. I'm Laura Wennes, and you've been listening to Civic. Before I let you go today, at the Public Press, which is Civic's parent organization, we've been working really hard during this pandemic to pursue angles we're not seeing much coverage of elsewhere, or to take a more systemic look at the issues that are surfacing in the headlines. The San Francisco Public Press is a nonprofit, and we're inspired by the public radio model. That's the idea that people who are able to support the work that we do so everyone can have access to it without paywalls or ads. If you think we're onto something, we'd very much appreciate if you could show your support. You can do that by going to sfpublicpress.org/donate or by helping us get the word out about this show. Subscribe on whichever podcast platform you use or leave us a review. It really does help, so thank you.